the law says they have to lease. But they've slowed down the permitting process. They've really limited the acreage that they've allowed to be auctioned. They've tried to place areas of land off limits with the Antiquities Act or with other conservation measures.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be discussing energy and the elections. My guest today is Kenny Stein. Kenny is the Vice President of Policy at American Energy Alliance. And you're going to discover how your vote in the upcoming elections will impact energy policy, prices, and the security here and around the world. Great to have you on the show today, Kenny. I think it's a great time to have you on because obviously we're getting close to game time, right? The election's coming up in November, and it's big for obviously the country, but also for the industry that I'm in, which is the oil and gas industry. I think that during the Biden administration, there's been a lot of a big war on hydrocarbons. And even with that big push that, they've tried to kill fossil fuels, the oil and gas industry still produced more oil and gas during this administration than any other time, in history. So, our industry continues to grow. So what are the major differences between the Biden policies and the Trump policies that are going to change?
Yeah, so I mean, it's unfortunate, honestly, in Washington, D.C., that energy policy issues have become very partisan. It's very polarized. So for most of the energy-related actions that the Biden administration's taken in the last 4 years, almost name any of them, and the Trump administration is going to want to do the opposite, pretty much. There's going to be a lot of attempts to roll back a bunch of their regulatory actions. A big one has actually been you talked about the growth of oil and natural gas production, but that's been happening on state and private lands. They've actually been very effective at suppressing production on federal lands, which is obviously where the White House has a lot more control over things. So that's another big place that policy is going to do probably a complete 180. They haven't succeeded in completely shutting down new leasing offshore and on federal lands, partly because the law says they have to lease. But they've slowed down the permitting process. They've really limited the acreage that they've allowed to be auctioned. They've tried to place areas of land off limits with the Antiquities Act or with other conservation measures. So a lot of those things will get turned around very quickly should Trump take office. But some of the regulatory things that takes time. Like there's administrative procedures that have to be undertaken. There's also a question of how quickly the Trump administration is going to want to go to reverse some of these things. They may try and mitigate some of the damage, or they may try and eliminate things completely. That's a little hard to tell, but yeah, it'll be for the oil and gas industry in particular. It's going to be a major turnaround.
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, obviously, we need energy in the country. We need energy in the world, and even with us producing as much oil as we are, we still see relatively high oil and gas prices, which has been one of the main drivers in inflation. And so if you're an investor sitting out there and looking at, what's going to happen, over the next several years, do you see oil prices trending downward, or do you see them basically stable to where they are today?
Well, that's the great irony that the Biden administration, while they've gone to war with the industry, they still complain about gas prices being too high. So, but yeah, and frankly, and this isn't just the Biden administration. Other governments who have gotten on the green train, even countries in Europe, you've seen them dialing back some of their mandates and regulations since gas prices went through the roof after Russia invaded Ukraine. When oil prices have been rising. When the rubber hits the road in a democratic society, people don't want their energy prices to be too high. So, and ultimately, the demand for these resources, both oil and natural gas, it's not going away anytime soon. You look at even the forecasts put out by some of the pro-green consultancies. we're still talking the majority of the global energy supply, majority American energy supply, primary energy supply is still coming from oil and natural gas many decades into the future. So the question of prices, well, natural gas obviously is regional variation. Prices in the US are likely to stay pretty low just because we have hundreds of years worth of the resource available. And with the ability to export any excess, domestic producers have plenty of incentive to continue producing, indefinitely into the future. On oil prices, obviously, U.S. oil prices are affected by fluctuations in global oil prices. There's no shortage of supply globally. And the question is going to be for the American industry in particular is how competitive they can be in getting their costs down and competing with places like Saudi Arabia. It's very cheap to produce. So we've seen a lot of technological innovation in the shale patch that has made production much cheaper. So it's going to be competition in that question. But as a global matter, there's enough resource out there that I don't necessarily see short of a global war. I don't see prices like skyrocketing the way that they have in the past, and that's because of American producers. If oil prices start to ramp up, there's a lot of American production available that they could go out and assuming the rigs are available, they can go out and drill more and produce more, and that's. And this is we're talking about some of the regulatory issues. The Biden administration is trying to make that harder to do. That responsiveness that the U.S. industry potentially has, a lot of that rests on some regulatory limitations too.
Well, putting aside all of the green energy and basically Biden trying to pander to his base. I mean, as far as to for all the climate activists out there. I mean, the energy industry continues to basically, as you said, have technological advances. We are able to produce oil and gas cheaper than what we did in the past, and of course Saudi Arabia, I think their capacity isn't a lot. I mean, when you look at the overall world consumption of oil and gas, I mean, we use about 100 million barrels a day in the world. And, here in the United States, we use close to 23 million barrels. And of course, Europe, they've been in a recession just like ourselves. But as they continue to come out of it, then, I see prices kind of stabilizing, in that 70 to $90 range for Brent. And I think that falls in line of what Saudi Arabia is looking for in the OPEC plus nations, is that they want to keep prices in that $80, $85 for Brent crude, right?
Yeah, that seems like a sweet spot, at least for Saudi Arabia. Now, some of the other countries like Iran and Venezuela, some of the other OPEC countries want it to be higher because their economies are more dependent on, and their costs of production are also higher. But yeah, I think for the Saudis, that seems to be where they feel like that, if they worry that prices that are too high will suppress demand, prices too low, obviously they can't support their budget. But that seems to be where they're happy with. And yeah, as you said, they've got a couple million barrels of extra capacity, but it's what a couple million barrels is like 1 to 2% of global production or global demand. So yeah, they can influence prices, but this is the thing, they've been forced to cut supplies in the last couple of years because of growing American production. So they've been forced to react to the American industry for a while now. So OPEC no longer drives prices the way they used to. They no longer control them fully.
So when we talk about, as far as OPEC's capacity, I mean, if Biden and his administration gets reelected, then obviously, we're in an election year. So they're kind of, saying that, we want oil and gas, we want, energy at this time. But, after the election, I mean, do you think it's going to be more of a hardcore push to just do away with fossil fuels altogether, even though we know that green energy really doesn't, I mean, when I say green energy, solar and wind really doesn't work yet to replace oil and gas, correct?
Right. Well, this is the what we when we talked about the Inflation Reduction Act and all the subsidies that the Biden administration got passed through Congress. That was an admission that uh, there was discussion of mandating wind and solar more aggressively and mandating electric vehicles, and that was dropped by Congress because there was a recognition that's not ready for prime time. So instead, they just sprayed out a bunch of money, subsidize everyone, hope that somebody will find the figure out this problem that the system doesn't work for for a modern economy. But the other game they've been playing that we've seen is even as they're trying to suppress domestic production, not all that successfully, but they've been trying. They've been going around globally and basically holding out the begging bowl, like trying to get Venezuela to produce more oil, trying to get Iran to produce more oil. So, instead of rely, it's they want oil from anybody but Americans, which is amazing. Even
Yeah.
Canadians, like they shut down the Keystone Pipeline. They don't want Canadian oil coming into the United States, but
Yeah.
they're willing to waive sanctions on some of the most murderous dictatorships in the world to get more oil. So it's they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Like they know their policies aren't doing much to suppress oil demand. They're trying to suppress supply, but the demand still has to come from somewhere.
Yeah. And the problem with producing more Venezuelan crude and more Iranian crude is that it's a dirty crude, right? It's not as
Yeah,
it's so actually
that's
it's
the
polluting
that's
the
that's another great irony. Well, so we actually tried to do a little paper sort of explaining that when you talk about environmental policies, um, the United States and there's a few other, like Norway and the UK still produce some oil, but there's a few Western countries with very high environmental standards that still produce oil and gas. But most oil and gas, well, natural gas is a little more variable, but oil is overwhelmingly produced in countries that have basically no environmental standards. So if you're going to stop producing in the US where we have very strict environmental standards and and then you're instead going to import from places where Venezuela, where they're poisoning the Amazon
yeah.
to produce their oil. It's wild, but it's just a myopic view that the United States, looking just at the United States and not thinking about the international consequences of what you're doing, because oil and gas are international industries. Like what you do in the United States is affected and affects what's going on in the rest of the world.
So what is the difference between the Republican and Democratic policies? I mean, obviously we know what the Biden administration is pushing, but do you actually have Democratic congressmen and senators that are basically backing this push?
Well, there's certainly a faction of the party, and part of the problem, I think, and I'll describe this as a problem, is that the most extreme progressive green faction of the Democratic Party has taken over policymaking in Washington. So that they're the people in this administration who are driving these decisions. If you recall, when Biden was running for office, he spoke much more moderately about a lot of these energy policy issues.
Right.
But his administration has been more radical far more radical even than the Obama administration. People talk about how they were very bad on energy policy. Biden administration has been even worse. But it's because that progressive environmentalist faction has taken over policymaking for the Democratic Party, and they attack any politician in the Democratic Party that deviates from the party, from not the party line, the progressive line. That's why you've seen Joe Manchin, who all Joe Manchin has done is tried to be a centrist on energy policy issues. And you've seen these protesters chasing him around, screaming at him, simply because he doesn't bow at the green altar. So there are Democratic politicians that know this is nonsense, and this is why I talked about in the process of negotiating the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of the more extreme things were dropped because there wasn't a majority of Democrats that were willing to support them. Forget getting Republicans on board, obviously. Um, but unfortunately, the progressive green left is very loud. They have a lot of money from their foundations and donors, and they attack, like they take no prisoners, and they've managed to silence the more centrist normal faction of the Democratic Party who knows a lot of this is crap, and frankly they represent people who care about energy prices. Like they don't want gas prices to be high, they don't want electricity prices going up, but the progressive left has pretty successfully managed to silence them, unfortunately.
Well, that was one of my other points, is that, if Biden continues to succeed in slowing down U.S. production, even though to date he really hasn't been able to, but if he continues to succeed in that, then of course that's just going to drive energy prices even higher, right? Because I don't think Saudi Arabia and other countries can pick up for the amount of oil and gas that we produce here in the United States.
Right. Well, like you said, they've got a little bit of extra capacity, but it's
Right.
it's not going to cover U.S. demand. And frankly, demand is rising, is going to rise in China. Demand's rising in India. There's South America and Africa use a tiny fraction of the amount of energy per capita that the United States uses, and those countries want to reach the level of development we have. So there will be future demand. So any suppression of production here in the U.S. Will lead to rising prices. And we talked about the industry has continued to produce record amounts, sort of in spite of the Biden administration. But a lot of those decisions were investment decisions that were made years ago, were made during the Trump administration. So what we're seeing today is the impacts of the Trump administration, really. And if you have another 4 years of the Biden administration not allowing new offshore development, not allowing new leasing, having the methane taxes on production, trying to limit pipeline construction, that the longer these policies stay in place, the more impact you're going to start to see. The impacts we just haven't started to see them because when you're talking multi-year timelines, some of these offshore projects could be 10 or 15 years. The fact that production is coming online today doesn't mean that the Biden administration is responsible for that. Let's put it that way.
No, I agree with you 100%, and I think that's one of the things that voters should think about when they vote this year, because I mean, these policies that are being made, a lot of them don't just have an instant effect on the market. It takes years. I mean,
Right.
if you're stopping pipelines, you're cutting off producing. I mean, these projects up in Alaska and the LNG. If you're trying to stop LNG production, I mean, production here in the United States, then obviously you may not see the effects of it this year, but 2 or 3 years down the road, when that investment goes somewhere else, I mean, we're going to find ourselves in a very serious situation, because oil and gas, overall is a depleting asset. So if you're not constantly trying to, replenish those barrels that you're producing today, and you're going to see much higher prices in the future.
Right. Well, and also there's a certain element of coasting on past successes that we see this especially in the electricity grid. Things have been fine. We're starting to see some of the impacts of some of these policies on the electricity grid. You're seeing rising electricity prices, and that's because we're seeing demand increases, particularly from data centers and AI, some of these technology demands. But for years now, the green imperative has been to shut down reliable power plants and replace it with unreliable wind and solar. And when demand is flat or falling, you can sort of get away with that for a while. But when you have increasing demand, that it becomes a problem that your electricity supplies are unreliable and prices start to go up. And we're just starting to see that now. And again, another 4 years of a Biden administration pushing this forced transition, it's only going to make things worse. And most of the year things will look fine. The same thing with oil and gas. Most of the year things might look fine, but you have an extreme cold winter in New England and you don't have any pipelines to ship Pennsylvania gas there. They've got to buy it on the global market or not, or have brownouts. And those things, these stresses you see at extreme moments. Like most of the year you can coast by and it seems like everything's doing fine until Russia invades Ukraine and energy prices spike and suddenly you're scrambling to find these resources. If you're not producing them at home, we want to be producing them at home so that we are less impacted by some of those extreme events.
Yeah, well, I know that for a fact during the 2020 freeze that we had here in Texas. I mean, obviously, we were without power, probably the first time in my life that we've ever experienced, going 4 or 5 days in freezing cold weather with no electricity. And so you can just imagine, that happening all around the country, not just in Texas, but everywhere else in the country, because the grid just can't support it. I mean, you come out with all these policies that that you're going to mandate electric cars, so many electric cars by a certain date. And, basically without even addressing the grid issue, I mean, that should be the first issue you address, correct? If you're going to try to push to a fully electric society, you better fix the grid first.
Well, yeah, it's not, and it's not just electric vehicles. They want to electrify, your gas stoves. They want to electrify home heating. The implications of what they want to do, what they say they want to do, is an enormous, like just a massive increase in electricity demand. It's hard to even fathom how much electricity demand that because like heating a home with electric resistance heat is actually uses a ton of energy. It's a lot less energy efficient than natural gas, frankly. So if you want to do that, you need an enormous increase in just electric production capacity, and it has to be responsive. Like this is, I'm from Houston, so my parents went through this too, but we've been through hurricanes and things. But if you lose power during a hurricane when it's warm out, it's uncomfortable, but you're not going to die.
Right.
The problem is in the winter, you lose heating, people die. Like it's
Yeah.
actually a life or death thing. So and this is what happened in Texas. People just weren't ready for it. And the electric grids in the northern United States know this, and so they have a lot more backup capacity for winter. Like that's part of their capacity markets, the way they design their systems. But that backup capacity is coal. And in New England, it's actually oil. Like fuel oil is their emergency backup on the coldest winters to run their power plants. So this is the fundamental problem with both wind and solar is that a lot of people, a lot of boosters say, oh, well, you can use batteries to back up wind and solar. Well, batteries can even out their production over a short period of time, but batteries don't produce electricity themselves. So fundamentally, you have to have a backup system, and it frankly ends up being natural gas is the way things operate right now. But you have to build basically an entire backup grid for emergencies and pay to maintain all these natural gas power plants to back up your wind and solar grid, even if you manage to get everything running on wind and solar. So it's fantastically expensive, and it is more dangerous for reliability purposes, and all for really no reason. Like we have the natural gas here in the United States. It's quite cheap, and it's extremely efficient. So why would we move away from something that's cheap, efficient, domestic? It's the logic of it is it's I mean, it's an ideological logic. It's not about the the best flourishing of American citizens. Let's put it that way.
So in the last couple of weeks, we've or I've read, that the Biden administration or the EPA, I guess, the strong arm of the Biden administration, now they're going after the, natural gas fired power plants, right? And trying to create more, policies around using natural gas to create electricity. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, so their most recent power plant rule, the main thrust of it is to finally to kill off the last few coal power plants that are out there. So the emission standards they set are ridiculously low, impossible for coal plants to meet. But they're also so low that natural gas plants have to do some sort of carbon capture or do something to try and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to qualify. And it's set low enough that the technology is not the carbon capture technology is not really proven in an economic sense. At the very least, it's fantastically expensive.
Yep. I agree.
Even if you can get it to work, it's really expensive. So it makes the investment decision on natural gas power plant much more difficult. Whereas right now it's kind of a no-brainer. Like it's easy to build. There's plenty of supply. But if these regulations, they're going to be challenged in court, and I frankly think they exceed the federal government's legal authority. But if they go into effect, they certainly would it would be a major impact. And like I said, natural gas right now is what is being built as backup for wind and solar. So if you make that harder to build or so expensive that it's impossible to build, then you are going to start, you're not going to have these occasional blackouts when you have an extreme storm. We're going to start having regular blackouts all throughout the year.
So where do the Biden and Trump, I mean, where do they stand on nuclear energy? Because obviously that may be a solution in the future as we need more energy.
Right. Well, that's all what's so interesting in these discussions, because if greenhouse gases are what you care about, if you want to eliminate greenhouse gases from the electricity system, then you should support a national build out of nuclear power, because nuclear power doesn't need natural gas backup, whereas wind and solar does. So, but what you hear, the problem is that one of the founding myths we talked about the progressive environmental left. One of their founding myths is nuclear power is dangerous and we need to eliminate nuclear power. So there's a fundamental tension in the environmental movement there's a lot of people that are committed to nuclear power being dangerous and deadly, and it's not, but this is a foundational belief for them. So turning that ship around has been it's starting to happen a little bit in Europe, actually. Interestingly enough, some of those countries have been turning away from the bans that they put in place on nuclear many decades ago. But in the United States, there is this it's an ideological belief that wind and solar can do it all. We don't need nuclear. So that's how they've resolved that tension, is that they just pretend that wind and solar is capable of doing it, so we don't need to really worry about nuclear. Now, the more practical energy modelers who actually run the numbers know that keeping existing nuclear open is absolutely required to have any chance of getting anywhere close to 100% renewables or 100% zero emission, whatever you want to call it. And there are certainly people in the Biden administration and in Congress that acknowledge this. There's a reason why in the Inflation Reduction Act there were subsidies for keeping nuclear power plants open was included in the subsidies that were being handed out. So there's some recognition of that, but fundamentally, it would take a major regulatory change at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to make nuclear power, new nuclear power, a real possibility in the United States. Because it just, as a regulatory matter, it's extraordinarily difficult to get a new plant built, and that's why it's so expensive. When you talk about the new Vogtle down in the South, it was years late and billions of dollars over budget. And to a large degree, that was regulatory hurdles that they were having to clear. So it is, again, if you're worried about emissions, then nuclear is your electricity solution, but you have to make it you have to be able to do it at a reasonable price still, because otherwise natural gas is, as we said, natural gas is cheap and efficient. So it's that natural gas competition is always out there. So in order for nuclear to outcompete that, you either need the government to mandate it, which the progressive left doesn't seem to be willing to do. They're not willing to give up that shibboleth. Or you need to make nuclear more competitive, which we'll see. We'll see if that can happen.
Well, I think a lot of these policies and regulations are hurting our industry. Not only, I mean, they're hurting the housing industry. I was reading yesterday, I guess, that about 40 to 50% of the cost to build a house is all because of the permitting issues and regulatory issues that these builders have to go through. And of course, we're seeing that more here in the United States regarding our energy policy. And do you think if Trump gets elected, will he be able to turn around a lot of these regulations?
Well, so in his first term, he tried to do some of the things. One of the Clean Water Act is one of the big places that the Clean Water Act permitting, that affects the oil and gas industry, but it also affects housing and highways and everything. So that's a place that the Trump administration did try making some changes. The Biden administration has promptly reversed them. So it's a question of, they certainly will try. Let's put it that way. It's a question of making them sustainable, and also how long it takes to turn the ship of state around. Because this is, even the Biden administration, as radical and aggressive as they've been, it's taken them, some of their biggest, most significant rules they've only released in the last 6 months to a year, because it takes several years to go through the administrative procedure process to get these things finalized and rolled out. And the problem with the rules that we've had that have come out with the Biden administration is that they're doing damage today, and the Trump administration will take them a couple of years to turn things around. But then there's also a question of sustainability. The Trump President Trump only would be able to serve one more term. So what comes after that? When you talk about building, housing or to building a pipeline, it's a multi-year construction project. It's a multi-year investment timeline. And if you don't know what's going to happen 4 years from now, it makes it hard to make some of these big investments.
Yeah, that's why I think we need a, sustainable energy policy. I don't even know if we have an energy policy here in the United States. I mean, it just seems like we go back and forth, every time there's a new administration comes in, the taxpayer ends up taking the brunt of it. And there's actually, is there an energy policy?
Well, unfortunately, the energy policy careens from whatever happens to be in people's heads at a given time. And it's unfortunately very reactive. A bunch of our energy policy regulations that we are dealing with now were passed in the 70s. And and obviously they were passed in response to, the wars in the Middle East and the supply shortages. That's not the problem we have today. Same thing, another big batch of the regulations that we deal with today were passed in the mid 2000s, where U.S. production was at the lowest that it's been. That was right around the time U.S. production turned around and started increasing. But that's where a lot of these wind and solar subsidies started in the first place, is because everyone was like, oh, we're running out of oil, we're running out of natural gas in the United States. So all these regulations were passed and they're never repealed. So there's this jumble of old things that were passed with ancient justifications, national security justifications, that don't apply anymore. But those laws are still there. So, I mean, I confess my free market bias. In my opinion, Congress should start repealing some of these old things instead of passing new things. But this is a problem with the incentive structure in Congress, is that you don't get rewarded for repealing old things or fixing old problems. Passing new legislation is what you get to trumpet and get what you get rewarded for. So if you're adding on another layer of complexity on top of this mess that already exists, maybe it marginally improves things here and there, but the overall thing is still a jumbled mess.
Yeah, it really is. And, it's just ridiculous. And I hope we get, a president in there that obviously that can change these policies. I agree with you. I mean, 4 years is not a long time to do anything in Washington, right? Because obviously, things just don't happen overnight. And as you were saying, a lot of these investments, I mean, they take 10 years to even, from the time they get on the drawing board to the time physically you go out and you physically start doing the work. I mean, sometimes it's 10, 12 years. And I don't see a lot of big companies wanting to make huge investments in something that gets reversed every, 4 or 5 years. So it seems very inefficient to me. And I'm glad that people like yourself are out there pointing all this out. And it was great to have you on the show today, Kenny. Can you tell our listeners how to follow you?
Yeah, well, it's just AmericanEnergyAlliance.org. That's pretty straightforward.
Well, I've read a lot of your articles and they're very good. And so I'd love to have you back in the future.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.